consider what it took to bring the Roman Republic to its knees. 3 catastrophic battlefield defeats in the span of just 2 years. At the Trebia River, Hannibal's army butchered nearly 30,000 Romans in a freezing winter ambush. At Lake Trasimene, an entire Roman consular army was swallowed by fog and slaughtered on the shoreline, with the consul himself cut down before he could even form a battle line. Then came Cannae, 70,000 dead in a single afternoon. For context, that is more than twice the number of American soldiers killed on every beach and in every field of the entire Normandy campaign combined. The Senate back in Rome ran out of gold rings to collect from the fingers of the fallen. And yet, Rome did not surrender. No treaty was signed. No white flag raised. While every other power in the ancient Mediterranean world would have bent the knee after even one of those defeats, Rome simply refused to lose. How does a civilization absorb that kind of punishment and still come back to salt the earth of its destroyer? Join us as we unravel one of the most astonishing stories of institutional endurance in all of human history. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Mediterranean Sea was not an empty highway. It was the beating heart of the ancient world, a vast blue arena where civilizations rose and fell by their command of its waters. 2 cities, separated by roughly 900 miles of open sea, had each built something extraordinary, and the world was not large enough for both of them. Rome's story began, as its own poets like to tell it, with blood. Twin brothers, a she-wolf, and a hill overlooking a muddy river bend. Whatever the myths obscured, the historical truth was remarkable enough. From a cluster of villages on the Tiber, Rome had spent 5 centuries grinding outward, absorbing its neighbors through war, alliance, and the patient extension of citizenship. By 264 before the Common Era, Rome controlled virtually the entire Italian peninsula. It was a republic governed by a senate of landed aristocrats and an assembly of citizens who voted, paid taxes, and above all, fought. The Roman legionnaire was a citizen first and a soldier second, which meant he had a personal stake in every victory and every defeat. Carthage had arrived at greatness by an entirely different road. Founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is today Tunisia, Carthage had turned commerce into an empire. Its merchants mapped the western Mediterranean before Rome had ventured beyond its own coastline. Silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, tin from the distant British Isles, all of it flowed through Carthaginian harbors. The city grew fabulously wealthy, and with wealth came power. Rather than fielding citizen armies, Carthage purchased its wars, hiring mercenaries from Numidia, Spain, and Greece, while its own sons captained the fleets that kept the trade routes open. The two systems produced 2 very different cultures. Rome placed supreme value on the citizen's duty to the state. Carthage valued results, profit, and the careful management of risk. One city built roads, the other built ships. For generations, the 2 powers had managed to coexist. As early as 509 before the Common Era, they had signed a formal treaty, a document so ancient that even the great Roman historian Polybius struggled to read its archaic Latin. The agreement was straightforward. Rome would stay off the sea lanes. Carthage would stay out of Italy. It was a partnership of mutual indifference, and it held more or less for over 2 centuries. But the world was changing. Rome's conquest of Italy had pushed its borders to the shores of Sicily, close enough to see the island that Carthage considered its own backyard. 2 expanding powers had arrived, at last, at the same shoreline. The treaty would not survive the view. Sicily in 264 before the Common Era was the richest island in the Mediterranean world. Fertile volcanic soil, 3 harvests a year, and harbors that sheltered ships from every corner of the ancient world. Whoever held Sicily held a key to everything. Carthage had understood this for centuries, controlling the western third of the island through a network of fortified cities and loyal trading partners. The Greeks had contested its eastern shores for generations, and Rome had watched from across the narrow Strait of Messina, close enough to smell the possibility. The crisis, when it came, arrived wrapped in the most unlikely packaging imaginable. A band of mercenaries called the Mamertines, soldiers from the Italian region of Campania, who had long since abandoned any loyalty except to themselves, had seized the city of Messana in the northeastern corner of Sicily. They had held it by force for years, raiding their neighbors and defying every authority that tried to dislodge them. When the Greek king of Syracuse finally moved against them with a serious army, the Mamertines faced a choice that would detonate a world war. They could appeal to Carthage, or they could appeal to Rome. They appealed to both nearly simultaneously, which was precisely the kind of chaos that changes history. Carthage moved first, stationing a garrison inside Messana's walls. It was a logical step. Carthage had no intention of allowing any rival power to control the strait between Sicily and Italy, a waterway no wider than a few miles at its narrowest point. But the Mamertines, perhaps fearing permanent Carthaginian occupation more than Syracusan punishment, expelled the Carthaginian garrison and repeated their appeal to Rome. What followed in the Roman Senate was one of the most consequential debates in ancient history. The senators were deeply uncomfortable. Rome had never projected military power beyond the Italian mainland. Intervening in Sicily meant not only breaking that precedent, but potentially rescuing a gang of brigands who had seized a city through murder and treachery. Several senators made exactly this argument. The Mamertines were criminals. Rome would look like their accomplice. But the popular assemblies, hungry for land and the spoils of war, voted for intervention. The die was cast. Here was the problem. Between Rome and Sicily sat water, and on the water there was Carthage. The Carthaginian navy was the finest military instrument of its age, built across generations of commercial necessity into an instrument of terrifying efficiency. Rome had virtually no navy at all. Its military genius had been perfected on dry ground, in the formation of the legions, in siegecraft and supply lines. The sea was another world entirely. Rome crossed the strait anyway. Its soldiers, unaccustomed to ships, crowded into whatever vessels could be gathered and lurched across to Messana. The immediate campaign went surprisingly well on land, with Roman legions forcing both the Carthaginian and Syracusan forces back from the city. But everyone involved understood that this opening skirmish had settled nothing. Carthage was not going to surrender its Sicilian position over a dispute involving a band of mercenary thugs. The First Punic War had begun, though neither side knew exactly what they had started. What began as a small intervention in a minor city's political crisis would consume both civilizations for 23 years and introduce Rome, reluctantly but irrevocably, to the world of naval power. Rome had set foot on the island. Now it had to learn how to fight for it. And that would require building something the Republic had never possessed before, a fleet capable of meeting Carthage on the open sea. How does a nation with no maritime tradition, no experienced sailors, and no fleet to speak of, challenge the greatest naval power the Mediterranean world has ever seen? The Roman answer was characteristically blunt. You build ships. You build them fast. And you find a way to make the ocean fight like dry land. The story of how Rome acquired its first real fleet has the quality of legend, which may be exactly what it is. According to ancient sources, Roman engineers came across a grounded Carthaginian quinquereme, a massive warship powered by 5 banks of rowers working in devastating coordination. They took it apart, studied it, and used it as a template. Within 60 days, the story goes, Rome had constructed 100 ships based on that single captured vessel. The number is almost certainly embellished. The underlying truth is not. Rome reverse-engineered Carthaginian naval technology and produced a fighting fleet through sheer industrial will. But Rome understood something important about itself. Its sailors were novices. Its rowers had never pulled together in combat conditions. Against Carthaginian crews who had trained for years, any conventional naval engagement would end in catastrophe. Rome needed an equalizer. What Roman engineers devised was called the corvus, meaning crow or raven in Latin. It was a boarding bridge mounted on a rotating pole at the prow of the ship, fitted with a heavy iron spike at its end. When a Carthaginian vessel came alongside, the corvus swung down and drove its spike into the enemy deck, locking the two ships together. What had been a naval battle instantly became something Roman soldiers understood completely: an infantry fight. The genius of the invention was psychological as much as mechanical. Rome had taken an alien environment and remade it according to Roman strengths. Carthage had spent generations mastering the ramming attack, the precise nautical choreography of striking an enemy hull at speed and pulling away before the enemy could respond. The corvus made that impossible. Every Carthaginian approach now risked being locked into a melee with Roman legionaries who lived for exactly that kind of fighting. The two sides met for the first major test in 260 before the Common Era, off the northern Sicilian coast near a town called Mylae. The Roman commander was Gaius Duilius, a man who had likely never commanded a warship before in his life. He faced a seasoned Carthaginian fleet confident in its experience and its tradition. The corvus changed everything. Carthaginian ships that moved in for the kill found themselves anchored to Roman vessels and then overrun by soldiers pouring across the boarding bridge. Duilius captured or destroyed roughly 50 Carthaginian ships. It was the first significant Roman naval victory in history, and it stunned the Mediterranean world. Rome celebrated with extraordinary theatricality. Duilius was awarded a triumph, the parade of conquest through the streets of Rome, an honor almost never given for naval achievements. A monument was erected in the Roman Forum decorated with the bronze rams stripped from captured Carthaginian warships. The message was deliberate. Rome had come to the sea, and the sea had better take notice. What the victory at Mylae could not disguise was how much Rome still had to learn. The years that followed would bring storms that swallowed entire fleets and disasters that would have broken any ordinary power. Rome lost more ships to weather than to enemy action, and responded each time by simply building more. The Republic's willingness to absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger was not merely impressive. It was something Carthage had never truly prepared for. The battle for Sicily was still very much alive, and it would demand an even heavier reckoning before either side found anything resembling resolution. What happens when two powers have fought for nearly a decade and neither can deliver a killing blow? They dig in. They bleed. And they discover just how much suffering their people can endure before something finally breaks. By 256 before the Common Era, Rome decided that Sicily was not enough. The war needed to be carried to Carthage itself, onto African soil, to the very doorstep of the enemy. The man chosen to lead this audacious invasion was Marcus Atilius Regulus, a consul of the old Roman mold, iron-willed and uncompromising. He landed his forces in North Africa with crushing momentum, winning a major engagement and sweeping toward Carthage with terrifying speed. For a brief moment, Rome stood on the edge of ending the war entirely. Then everything collapsed. Carthage hired a Spartan mercenary commander named Xanthippus, who reorganized the Carthaginian army with cold professional efficiency. In the battle that followed, Regulus was routed, his legions destroyed, and the consul himself captured alive. He would die in Carthaginian captivity, and the invasion of Africa would die with him. The gamble had failed completely, and Rome had nothing to show for it but graves and humiliation. The sea offered no comfort either. Nature herself seemed to have taken Carthage's side. Returning from the African campaign, a Roman fleet of perhaps 350 ships sailed into a storm off the Sicilian coast near Camarina. Ancient sources record that around 280 vessels were lost, along with somewhere between 100,000 and 115,000 men. The numbers strain belief, even now. Whether or not every figure is precise, the scale was catastrophic by any measure in the ancient world. Rome had lost more sailors to weather in a single afternoon than most nations lost in entire wars. It happened again in 253 before the Common Era. Another fleet. Another storm. Another staggering loss of ships and lives. The ocean was consuming Roman ambitions faster than enemy action ever could. And yet Rome kept building. The grinding center of the war shifted back to Sicily, where the siege of Lilybaeum became the conflict's longest and most punishing chapter. Lilybaeum was Carthage's great western Sicilian stronghold, its harbor protected by shallow reefs that made naval assault nearly impossible. Roman forces surrounded it by land and attempted blockades by sea. The Carthaginians resupplied it with fast ships that slipped through Roman lines with almost contemptuous ease. Year after year, the siege continued, consuming men and resources on both sides without resolution. Into this stalemate stepped a figure whose shadow would fall across the entire next generation of the conflict. Hamilcar Barca, appointed to command Carthaginian forces in western Sicily, was something Rome had not encountered in quite this form before. He did not fight set-piece battles he could not win. Instead, he moved. He raided. He occupied mountain strongholds and launched strikes against Roman positions before melting back into difficult terrain. His campaign from Mount Eryx was a masterclass in what later ages would call guerrilla warfare, and it drove Roman commanders to distraction. They could not pin him down. They could not force a decisive confrontation. He simply continued to exist, costing Rome blood and treasure indefinitely. Hamilcar was not winning the war, but he was showing a kind of military imagination that pointed towards something far more dangerous than anything Rome had yet faced. The First Punic War would finally exhaust itself not through conquest but through financial ruin, as both powers discovered the limits of what even determined peoples can sustain. The peace that followed was uneasy, resentful, and temporary. For one Carthaginian family in particular, it was simply the pause before something far larger began. By 241 before the Common Era, Rome was broke. The treasury that had funded fleet after fleet, that had absorbed storm losses beyond counting and kept legions supplied through years of Sicilian stalemate, had reached its limit. The Roman state simply did not have the money to build another navy. The war machine that had consumed a generation of Roman men and treasure had ground itself down to bare metal. What happened next says everything about the Roman character. Private citizens stepped forward. Roman aristocrats and wealthy merchants funded the construction of a new fleet out of their own pockets, offering ships as loans to the state on the understanding that victory would make them whole. This was not charity. It was confidence, the deep, almost irrational confidence of a people who had lost fleets to storms, legions to African soil, and men to 23 years of grinding war, and still could not conceive of accepting defeat. 200 warships were built. The republic that could not afford them built them anyway. The Carthaginian fleet they would face had its own mission: to resupply Hamilcar Barca's forces still holding out on Sicily, still raiding, still refusing to break. The Carthaginian commander Hanno loaded his ships with troops, supplies, and the materials Hamilcar needed to keep fighting indefinitely. He sailed toward the Aegates Islands, a small cluster of rocks off Sicily's western tip in early March. The Romans were waiting. The Battle of the Aegates Islands on the 10th of March, 241 before the Common Era, was brutal and one-sided in a way that almost nothing in the preceding 2 decades had been. The Roman fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, caught the Carthaginian ships heavy-laden and poorly positioned. The Romans had trained their crews for months. The Carthaginians were overloaded and outmaneuvered. Somewhere between 50 and 70 Carthaginian ships were sunk, and an additional 70 were captured. Perhaps 10,000 Carthaginian sailors were taken prisoner. The war was over. Not with a siege, not with a legendary land battle, with a naval engagement that lasted a single morning. Carthage, watching its resupply mission destroyed and its treasury equally exhausted, opened negotiations. The terms Rome imposed were punishing. Carthage was to evacuate Sicily entirely, the island that had triggered the whole catastrophe 23 years before. Carthage was also to pay a war indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, a staggering sum to be delivered over 10 years. When Rome decided the initial terms were too lenient, it added another 200 talents on top. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The shape of the Mediterranean world had changed permanently. But something else had been established that mattered more than any territorial acquisition. A lesson had been written into the bones of Roman culture so deeply that it would guide Roman strategy for centuries to come. The lesson was simple. Defeat is never final. Storms take your fleets. You build more fleets. Commanders destroy your armies. You raise more armies. The treasury empties. Your citizens fill it. You do not stop. You cannot be made to stop. Persistence is not merely a virtue in this telling of history. It is the supreme military strategy. Carthage had won battles. Rome had won the war. The distinction between those two outcomes would define everything that followed. Hamilcar Barca was still in the field when the peace was signed, his forces undefeated, his genius for war entirely intact. He accepted the terms because he had no choice, laid down a command he had never surrendered in combat, and began the long journey home. He brought with him something more dangerous than any army, a grievance and a young son named Hannibal who was watching everything his father did. The ink was barely dry on the peace treaty when Carthage's empire began to devour itself. Tens of thousands of mercenaries had fought for Carthage across Sicily, soldiers drawn from Libya, Iberia, Gaul, and the Greek cities, men who had endured years of grinding warfare on the promise of payment. When they were shipped back to North Africa, that payment did not come. Carthage, stripped of Sicily and buried under a mountain of Roman war debt, simply could not afford them. The soldiers who had bled for the city were told, in effect, to wait. They stopped waiting in 241 before the Common Era. What followed was one of the most savage conflicts in ancient history. The mercenaries, joined by tens of thousands of Libyan subjects who had long chafed under Carthaginian taxation, rose in open revolt. They surrounded Carthage itself, cut off its supply lines, and at several moments came terrifyingly close to burning the city to ash. They tortured and crucified Carthaginian commanders. They murdered prisoners and hostages. Ancient sources called it the Truceless War, and the name was earned. Neither side offered mercy. Neither side expected it. Into this nightmare stepped Hamilcar Barca. The general who had never been beaten in Sicily now fought the war that would define his legend. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely pitiless. He trapped a large mercenary force in a narrow valley near the town of Prione and let starvation do his killing for him. He crucified rebel leaders. He trained his war elephants to trample surrendered prisoners. By 237 before the Common Era, after nearly 4 years of butchery, the revolt was crushed. Carthage had survived, but only barely, and only because one man had refused to let it fall. Rome watched all of this with calculating eyes. While Carthage bled, Rome made its move. Sardinian mercenaries, themselves in revolt, sent an invitation to Rome. Come take the island. Rome had no legal claim to Sardinia. The peace treaty of 241 said nothing about it. None of that mattered. Rome presented Carthage with an ultimatum: hand over Sardinia and Corsica, and pay an additional 1,200 talents of silver or face renewed war. Carthage, exhausted and nearly broken, could not fight. It paid. It surrendered both islands without a battle. It was theft, naked and documented, and everyone knew it. The Roman historian Polybius, no enemy of Rome, called it an act that could not be justified. The effect on Hamilcar Barca was transformative. He had watched Rome impose a humiliating peace after a war Carthage had nearly won on land. He had then watched Rome exploit Carthage's moment of maximum weakness to steal territory by threat alone. When he turned westward toward Iberia, beginning the expansion that would give Carthage new wealth and new armies, he carried that injury with him. He made certain his son carried it too. In 237 before the Common Era, Hamilcar Barca loaded his army onto ships and crossed into Iberia. He left behind a ruined treasury, a humiliated city, and a peace that felt more like a slow execution. What he found on the other side of the Mediterranean was something Carthage desperately needed: space, resources, a second chance. Iberia was not empty. The peninsula was home to dozens of fierce tribal peoples, the Iberians and Celtiberians among them, warriors who had resisted outside control for generations. Hamilcar would spend 9 years fighting them, cajoling some into alliance, crushing others into submission, pressing steadily northward and inland. He built supply lines, extracted silver from mines that had barely been touched, and recruited Iberian fighters into an army that grew more formidable with every campaign season. He was not simply raiding. He was building. Before he sailed, a scene played out that ancient sources preserved with particular care. His young son Hannibal, perhaps 9 years old, begged to come along. Hamilcar refused at first. Then, according to the tradition, he relented, but only after leading the boy to the altar of sacrifice and demanding an oath. Hannibal swore, before the gods and the sacred flame, that he would be Rome's eternal enemy. Whether the story is precisely true hardly matters. What matters is that 2 generations of Barcid leaders believed it to be true and shaped their lives accordingly. Hamilcar died in 229, drowned during a winter river crossing while covering the retreat of his troops. Command passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, a man of different temperament but equal ambition. Where Hamilcar had conquered, Hasdrubal consolidated. He was a diplomat as much as a soldier, securing alliances through negotiation and strategic marriage rather than always through force. He founded a city on the southeastern coast of Iberia, a magnificent natural harbor surrounded by a lagoon on 3 sides. He called it Carthage, which the Romans would translate as Carthago Nova. New Carthage. The city sat at the center of the richest silver mining region in the ancient world, and it gave the Barcid project something it had lacked under Hamilcar: a capital, a port, a place from which to project power in every direction. Rome noticed. A growing Carthaginian presence in Iberia, flush with silver and commanding tens of thousands of troops, was not something the Senate could ignore forever. In roughly 226, Roman envoys met with Hasdrubal and extracted an agreement. Carthage would not move its forces north of the Ebro River. Rome, in turn, implicitly acknowledged everything south of it as Carthaginian territory. It was a line drawn across a map that neither side had fully explored. Both parties understood what the treaty really meant. Rome was watching. Carthage was waiting. Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221, killed by a Celtiberian servant settling a personal grievance. The army in Iberia made its choice of successor immediately and unanimously. The soldiers acclaimed their new commander without waiting for approval from Carthage's Senate, without consulting anyone. The man they chose was 25 years old. He had grown up in these camps, learned war from his father, and carried an oath sworn at an altar when he was still a child. Hannibal Barca took command of the finest army Carthage had ever assembled in the richest territory Carthage had ever controlled, pointed directly at a treaty line he had no intention of honoring. The next war was no longer a question of whether. It was only a question of when. He did not wait long. Hannibal spent his first year in command doing what his father and brother-in-law had taught him to do. He campaigned northwest, pushing into territories the Barcids had not yet fully subdued, moving with a speed and decisiveness that astonished even veterans who had served under Hamilcar. He was learning his army, and his army was learning him. By the time he turned his attention south and east toward the Mediterranean coast, his soldiers would have followed him anywhere. The city of Saguntum sat on a rocky hill overlooking the sea, roughly 100 miles south of the Ebro River. Technically, this placed it within the Carthaginian sphere, recognized by the treaty with Hasdrubal. But Saguntum had done something inconvenient. It had cultivated a formal friendship with Rome, the kind of relationship the Romans called an alliance, and the kind Hannibal could not ignore. A Roman-aligned city inside Carthaginian territory was a splinter under the skin. He intended to remove it. In the spring of 219 before the Common Era, Hannibal brought his army to the walls of Saguntum and began the siege. The Saguntines sent desperate appeals to Rome. They had been promised protection. Where were the legions? The legions did not come. Rome in 219 was occupied elsewhere, managing conflicts in Illyria across the Adriatic, and the Senate debated and delayed with the particular genius that democratic bodies possess for inaction at critical moments. They sent envoys to Hannibal ordering him to desist. He dismissed them. They sent envoys to Carthage demanding he be handed over for punishment. Carthage refused. For 8 months, Saguntum held. The defenders fought with the ferocity of people who understood, with terrible clarity, that no rescue was coming. But stone walls and desperate courage could not hold forever against a commander who had spent years learning exactly how to break both. The city fell in the autumn. Hannibal sold the survivors into slavery and stripped the city of everything valuable, distributing wealth among his troops and sending a portion back to Carthage. He had crossed the treaty line. He had destroyed a Roman ally. He had done it openly, deliberately, while Rome watched. The Romans recognized a provocation when they saw one. Early in 218, a Roman delegation arrived in Carthage with a demand so stark it barely qualified as diplomacy. Hand over Hannibal. Accept responsibility for what he had done. Or face war. The Carthaginian Senate refused. The Roman ambassador gathered his toga in both hands, forming a fold in the fabric, and told the assembled council that he held within it both peace and war. They could choose which he would release. The Carthaginians told him to release whichever he wished. He released war. But Hannibal had not waited for this ceremony to complete itself. He already knew what was coming because he had designed it to come. While diplomats exchanged ultimatums, he was planning a campaign unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Rome expected the war to play out as the first one had, naval engagements and grinding attrition across Sicily and the western Mediterranean. Hannibal intended to give them something else entirely. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would march his army overland through Gaul, cross the Alps, and descend into Italy itself. He would carry the war to the Roman heartland, shatter Rome's alliances with the Italian peoples who sustained her armies, and force the Republic to its knees on its own soil. It was, by any reasonable measure, an insane plan, which is precisely why it almost worked. In the spring of 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal marched out of Carthago Nova with a force that made the ground tremble beneath it. Roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Those gray mountains of muscle and noise that terrified horses and men alike. The army was Iberian and Numidian and Libyan, a polyglot force bound together not by shared language or citizenship, but by something rarer and more powerful: faith in the man who led them. The first obstacle was the Pyrenees. Thousands of Iberian troops, unwilling to march into an unknown war so far from home, turned back here. Hannibal let them go. He needed willing men, not reluctant ones. He crossed the mountains with roughly 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, already smaller than when he had set out, and descended into the vast tribal territories of Gaul. The Gauls were not friendly. They were not exactly enemies either, but they were suspicious of an enormous foreign army moving through their lands, and suspicion in the ancient world had a way of becoming violence quickly. Hannibal negotiated where he could, bribed where negotiation failed, and fought when both failed. He pushed steadily eastward through the summer heat, toward the wide ribbon of the Rhone River. The Rhone presented a genuine crisis. A large Roman fleet under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had landed at the Greek colony of Massalia on the Mediterranean coast, and Scipio was moving north to intercept him. For the first time, the two armies that would define the next 15 years of history were within striking distance of each other. But Hannibal had no interest in fighting here. Not on Roman terms, not this far from Italy. He needed to cross the river and disappear into the Alps before Scipio could force an engagement. The crossing of the Rhone became a masterpiece of improvisation. Hannibal dispatched a cavalry detachment far upstream to ford the river quietly and come around behind the warriors guarding the opposite bank. Then he began the river crossing with every boat and raft and hollowed log his army could find or build. The terrified elephants were coaxed onto large rafts covered with earth to convince the animals they were still on solid ground. When the Gauls on the far bank heard the signal fire from Hannibal's cavalry behind them, caught between two forces, they broke and fled. The entire army crossed intact. Scipio arrived 3 days too late. He found an empty camp, the embers of Hannibal's fire still faintly warm. He made a decision that would have profound consequences. He sent the bulk of his army on to Spain to cut off Hannibal's supply lines, then sailed back toward Italy to wait. Then came the Alps. 15 days. That is how long it took to cross, and those 15 days cost Hannibal more than any battle he would ever fight. The army climbed into a world of rock and cold and silence, following passes that local guides identified reluctantly and sometimes treacherously. Gallic tribes in the high valleys rolled boulders down onto the columns from above, shattering men and animals in the narrow defiles where there was nowhere to run. The early autumn snow had already come, coating the paths in a lethal glaze. Pack animals lost their footing and fell into gorges. Men simply lay down and did not rise again. Hannibal kept them moving. At one impassable rock face, his engineers used fire and vinegar to crack the stone and hack a path through for the elephants. He pushed them forward with the certainty of a man who understood that stopping was death. When the army finally descended into the sunlight of the Po Valley, the numbers told a brutal story. Perhaps 26,000 men remained, barely half of those who had left Iberia. Most of the elephants had survived the crossing, though many would die in the Italian winter ahead. The army was exhausted, frostbitten, and starving. But they were in Italy, and Rome had no idea they were coming. No enemy had crossed the Alps to invade the Italian heartland within living Roman memory. The psychological tremor this produced in Rome would be almost as devastating as any battle. They were exhausted, half-starved, and far from home. But Hannibal had his army in Italy, and now he needed to show the Gallic tribes of the Po Valley something they had not seen in a generation: Romans bleeding. He did not have to wait long. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had sailed back from the Rhone too late to stop the Alpine crossing, moved north to intercept the Carthaginian army near the Ticinus River in November of 218. It was a probing action, a cavalry reconnaissance more than a pitched battle, and it ended badly for Rome almost immediately. Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, the finest light cavalry in the known world, swept around the Roman flanks with a speed and fluidity that Roman cavalry simply could not match. Scipio himself was wounded in the fight, saved from death only by the intervention of his young son, a boy who would one day carry the name Africanus and bring Carthage to its knees. For now, the elder Scipio retreated south, wounded in body and badly shaken in confidence. Word spread through the Gallic tribes of the Po Valley like fire through dry grass. The Romans could be hurt. The man from Carthage had crossed the mountains and drawn first blood within weeks of arriving. Thousands of Gauls began flocking to Hannibal's camp. This alarmed Rome deeply, and it alarmed the second consul of that year even more. Tiberius Sempronius Longus had been preparing an invasion of Africa when the news of Hannibal's crossing reached him. He force-marched his army north from Sicily, desperate to reach Italy before the year's campaigning ended, desperate above all to win glory before the consular elections of the following year stripped him of his command. Sempronius was brave, ambitious, and dangerously impatient. Hannibal had studied the type carefully. The trap was set on the banks of the Trebia River in December, on one of the coldest mornings of that bitter winter. Hannibal placed his brother Mago with a force of nearly 2,000 elite infantry and cavalry in the dense brush on the Roman flank, invisible and silent. Then he sent his Numidian horsemen across the river to sting the Roman camp before dawn. Sempronius rose to the bait without hesitation. He roused his army before breakfast, before they could warm themselves or eat, and ordered them to cross the Trebia to meet the enemy. The soldiers waded into water cold enough to cause physical shock, chest high in places, their limbs numbing, their bodies robbed of heat before a single sword was drawn. By the time they formed their battle lines on the far bank, they were shivering and weakened, facing fresh Carthaginian troops who had spent the morning eating hot food beside warm fires. The battle that followed was systematic destruction. Hannibal's heavier cavalry crushed the Roman horsemen on both flanks. Mago's hidden force erupted from the undergrowth and struck the Roman rear. The center held, briefly and desperately, a column of perhaps 10,000 men who fought their way through the Carthaginian lines through sheer Roman stubbornness and escaped toward Placentia. They were the lucky ones. Roughly 20,000 to 30,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured that December morning. The river ran warm for hours afterward. The news that reached Rome was shattering. In less than 2 months on Italian soil, Hannibal had ambushed and destroyed a consular army. The Gallic tribes were joining him by the thousands. The northern frontier was gone. And the man who had done this had done it with an army that was still recovering from the Alps, with soldiers who were not even Roman citizens fighting so far from home that resupply was nearly impossible. If Rome's generals were beginning to understand the kind of enemy they faced, the worst was still ahead. The following summer, On the shores of a lake in Etruria, Hannibal would engineer the largest ambush in military history. Spring of 217 brought Hannibal south, but the road through Etruria was barred by the Apennine Hills and the flooded marshes of the Arno Valley. Any sensible commander would have waited. Hannibal pushed through anyway. For 4 days and 3 nights, the Carthaginian army waded through fetid swampland that swallowed men whole. Soldiers slept on the bodies of pack animals to keep above the waterline. Disease tore through the ranks. Hannibal himself contracted a severe eye infection, and by the time the army emerged onto dry ground near Fiesole, he had lost the sight in his right eye entirely. He had paid a steep personal price simply to enter the killing ground. But he was inside Rome's defenses now, standing between the consul Gaius Flaminius and the city of Rome itself. Flaminius was exactly the kind of opponent Hannibal preferred. A populist politician with genuine courage and almost no patience, he commanded an army of roughly 30,000 men at Arretium and burned with the desire to bring this Carthaginian ravager to battle before his colleague consul Gnaeus Servilius Geminus could arrive and share the glory. Hannibal understood this about him perfectly. What followed was one of history's most calculated acts of psychological provocation. Hannibal marched his army directly past the Roman camp without attacking it, then began systematically burning and looting the Etruscan countryside that Flaminius was honor-bound to protect. Farm by farm, village by village, the smoke rose into the Italian sky. Flaminius watched from behind his walls as his allies were ruined, and the taunting was unbearable. His officers urged caution. He overruled them. The Carthaginian army led him south like a fish following bait, moving through the narrow corridor between the hills and the northern shore of Lake Trasimene. On the morning of June the 24th, a thick fog rolled off the water and swallowed the landscape whole. Hannibal had spent the previous night positioning his forces. Celtic and Spanish infantry blocking the road ahead, cavalry sealing the exit behind, light troops hidden in the hills along both flanks. The trap was 3 miles long. Flaminius marched his army into it at dawn, column formation, completely blind, the fog so dense that men at the front could barely signal men at the rear. When the hillside erupted with screaming warriors, the Romans had no room to form battle lines, no space to respond with any kind of order. They were packed between the hill slope and the lake's edge, men stumbling into the water, men dying before they understood what was happening. The consul Flaminius was pulled from his horse and killed within the first minutes. The army he commanded ceased to exist as a fighting force in roughly 3 hours. Approximately 15,000 Romans died along that lakeshore. Another 10,000 were captured. A cavalry relief force that arrived too late was ambushed separately and nearly wiped out as well. The fog burned off by mid-morning, revealing the full scale of what had happened. Rome received the news through the praetor Marcus Pomponius, who reportedly told the gathered crowds with stark economy, "We have been defeated in a great battle." The city went into immediate crisis. For the first time in 120 years, Rome appointed a dictator. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus, a cautious aristocrat who understood something his predecessors had refused to accept. Direct confrontation with Hannibal was not a strategy. It was a death wish. Fabius would earn the name the Delayer, and Romans would curse him for it before they thanked him. But at Trasimene, Rome had finally learned a lesson that would reshape the entire war, though not quite in time to prevent one final catastrophe. Quintus Fabius Maximus took one long look at the situation and chose to do almost nothing. For a Roman, this required extraordinary courage. His strategy was simple in concept and agonizing in practice. He would shadow Hannibal's army through the hills of southern Italy, always keeping to high ground, always staying just beyond reach. He would burn crops ahead of the Carthaginian advance, poison wells, raid foraging parties, cut off stragglers. He would deny Hannibal food, deny him rest, deny him the one thing he needed most of all, a decisive battle that might shatter Roman resolve and peel away her Italian allies. Hannibal tried everything to force the issue. He marched provocatively through Campania, one of the most fertile and loyal regions in Rome's Italian network, burning estates and driving off cattle within sight of Fabius's hilltop camps. The Roman dictator watched the smoke rise and did not move. He tried the same psychological torment that had broken Flaminius at Trasimene, parading devastation before an enemy he knew felt honor-bound to respond. Fabius did not feel honor-bound. He felt patient. The Roman people, however, felt humiliated. Fabius had been appointed to save the Republic, not to watch it burn from a safe distance. His nickname, Cunctator, the delayer, was not offered as a compliment. It was flung at him like an insult in the streets of Rome. His own master of horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, openly ridiculed his caution and eventually maneuvered politically to have his own powers elevated to match the dictator's. Rome, it seemed, would rather fight boldly and lose than wait carefully and survive. Then came the moment that revealed something essential about Hannibal's own situation. Caught in the narrow pass near Mons Caligula, with Fabius's forces finally blocking his route north and a chance for a genuine Roman victory within reach, Hannibal faced what looked like a trap. His response was theatrical and utterly ruthless. His men gathered 2,000 cattle from the surrounding farms and tied bundles of dry torches to their horns. At midnight, they lit them. 2,000 panicked animals stampeded up the hillside in the darkness, a river of fire lurching toward the Roman positions. The sentries, convinced they were witnessing a massive flanking attack, abandoned their posts. Hannibal's army slipped quietly through the gap and was gone before dawn. When Romans later told this story, they could not quite decide whether to laugh or shudder. Fabius's term as dictator expired without a single major engagement. Rome interpreted this as failure. The pressure building in the Senate and in the streets pointed in one direction, toward a massive, overwhelming confrontation that would settle the question of Hannibal once and for all. 2 new consuls would be elected for 216. They would raise the largest army Rome had ever assembled, roughly 86,000 men, and march south toward a small grain depot on the Aufidus River called Cannae. The morning of August the 2nd, 216 BC, broke hot and dry along the Aufidus River in southeastern Italy. A parching wind blew in from the southeast. The locals called it the Vulturnus, carrying dust directly into Roman eyes. It was, some survivors would later note, as though the land itself had conspired against them. Rome had done something remarkable in the months following Fabius's quiet disgrace. It had raised an army of approximately 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, the largest force the Republic had ever put into the field. The message was unmistakable. No more shadows, no more hilltops, no more waiting. Rome would simply overwhelm Hannibal with sheer mass of Roman flesh and iron. The problem was the men commanding this extraordinary force. The 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, despised each other and rotated command daily according to Roman custom. Paulus was cautious, experienced, suspicious of the open ground Hannibal had chosen. Varro was aggressive, politically popular, and utterly convinced that numerical superiority made strategy unnecessary. On August the 2nd, command belonged to Varro. Hannibal looked at the Roman army assembling across the plain and saw not a threat but an opportunity. He had roughly 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 on foot. A conventional general would have found defensible terrain. Hannibal found a solution in geometry. He arranged his infantry in a formation that military historians still study with something approaching reverence. His weaker Gallic and Spanish troops occupied the center. But he pushed that center forward, toward the Romans, creating a convex bulge pointing directly at the enemy line. His veteran African infantry waited on the flanks, held back, patient. His superior cavalry anchored both wings. What happened next unfolded with the terrible logic of a closing fist. Varro ordered the advance. The Romans packed their infantry tighter than usual, hoping concentrated mass would simply punch through whatever stood before them. They struck the Carthaginian center and began to push. The Gallic and Spanish soldiers gave ground, deliberately, step by step. The convex bulge inverted, becoming concave, a bowl drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into its curve. The legions pressed forward, packed ever tighter, shields overlapping, men crowding men, until those in the middle could barely raise their sword arms. On the wings, Carthaginian cavalry had already destroyed their Roman counterparts and swung around behind the Roman mass. Hannibal's African veterans on the flanks pivoted inward. The encirclement was complete. What followed was not a battle. It was a compression. 70,000 Roman soldiers stood packed so tightly they could not fight, could not retreat, could barely breathe. The Carthaginians worked methodically around the edges of this heaving, screaming mass. Men suffocated before swords ever reached them. The fortunate ones died quickly. By late afternoon, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead in an area roughly 2 miles long. Among them were 80 senators, 2 quaestors, and nearly half of Rome's military officer class. Lucius Aemilius Paulus died on the field, refusing a horse that might have carried him to safety. Varro fled. The kill rate was approximately 600 men per minute, sustained across several hours. No battle in Western history would produce comparable single-day losses until the first day of the Sum, more than 2,000 years later. In Carthage, Hannibal's cavalry commander Maharbal urged an immediate march on Rome itself. "Give me the horses," he reportedly told Hannibal, "and you will dine on the capital within 5 days." Hannibal hesitated, and Maharbal offered a verdict that echoed through the centuries. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use one." Cannae should have ended Rome. Every rational calculation suggested it would. King Philip V of Macedon signed an alliance with Carthage. Capua, Rome's second city, opened its gates to Hannibal. The Italian alliance seemed finally to be fracturing. But Rome did not fall. It did not even flinch. The Senate convened within days of receiving the news from Cannae. Survivors were still staggering into the city, still covered in the dust and blood of the Aufidus plain, when Rome's leaders took their seats and made decisions that would define the next 4 centuries of Western civilization. Hannibal had sent an envoy, a Carthaginian officer named Carthalo, carrying terms. He had also retained thousands of Roman prisoners and offered to return them for a negotiated ransom. It was a reasonable offer, almost a generous one. After Cannae, reasonable men would have listened. The Senate rejected it without serious debate. The prisoners, the Senate declared, were not worth ransoming. Men who had been captured rather than dying at their posts had demonstrated insufficient commitment to Roman values. They could remain in Carthaginian hands. When a delegation of prisoners arrived to plead their own case, the senators sent them back. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message aimed less at Hannibal than at Rome itself. There would be no negotiation. There would be no acknowledgement that Cannae had broken anything fundamental. Then came a gesture so audacious it strains belief. As Hannibal's army camped in the countryside outside Rome, a Roman land auction proceeded on schedule. One of the parcels sold that week was the very land on which Hannibal's soldiers had pitched their tents. It sold at full market value. The Senate was telling its citizens, and through them the world, that they considered Hannibal's presence a temporary inconvenience, not a permanent fact. Whether the story is precisely accurate matters less than what it reveals. This was the Roman response to catastrophe, not despair but contempt. The practical mobilization was equally remarkable. Rome's military roles had been devastated. The solution was to reach for men the Republic had never before asked to serve. Boys of 17 were enrolled in the legions. The minimum age quietly lowered when the bodies ran out. Convicted criminals were offered freedom in exchange for military service. Most dramatically, the Senate purchased approximately 8,000 slaves directly from their owners, armed them, and organized them into functioning military units. Freemen who had never held a shield were handed one and told that Rome required their lives. This was extraordinary. Roman society was built on rigid distinctions between citizen and slave, free and bound. In the weeks after Cannae, those distinctions dissolved in the face of necessity. The new legions that began forming were unlike anything Rome had fielded before. Desperate, composite, raw. But they existed, and they were growing. Meanwhile, Hannibal faced a problem his victory had not solved. The Italian alliance, that network of Latin and allied cities whose manpower Rome depended upon, had not collapsed as he had planned. Yes, Capua had opened its gates, a significant defection from a city of real strategic importance. Several other southern Italian communities followed, most notably the Samnites and some of the Greek coastal cities. But the Latin colonies, the heartland of Rome's military reserve, held firm. They had received the same message as everyone else from Cannae and drawn the opposite conclusion from the one Hannibal had intended. This was Maharbal's real indictment of his commander, made explicit in the days after the battle. The cavalry general's legendary rebuke that Hannibal knew how to win victories but not how to use them pointed to something specific. Every day Hannibal spent reorganizing, negotiating, and waiting for Rome's allies to collapse was a day Rome spent building new legions from slaves and 17-year-olds and convicted criminals. The Senate had grasped something Hannibal had not. Rome's strength was never primarily its armies. Its armies could be destroyed, had been destroyed repeatedly. Rome's strength was the system that rebuilt those armies, the institutions, the social contracts, the sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept that losing battles meant losing wars. Hannibal had won the most perfect tactical victory in ancient history. He now had to win a different kind of war entirely, and for that, he had no plan at all. The years after Cannae settled into something uglier and more grinding than any single catastrophic battle. Hannibal controlled the Italian countryside in the south, his army undefeated in open combat, and yet Rome had found a way to make his victories meaningless. The answer was the Fabian strategy, resurrected and applied with cold discipline across multiple armies and multiple fronts. Rome fielded as many as 25 legions simultaneously in the years following 216 BC, shadowing Hannibal across Campania, Apulia, and Lucania. These forces marched where he marched, camped where he camped, and refused to be drawn into the open engagement he desperately needed. Hannibal could burn farms. He could not burn the war into a conclusion. Into this grinding stalemate stepped a man Romans would call the Sword of Rome. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was everything Fabius was not. Aggressive, restless, and hungry for personal glory, he had already won the rarest honor in Roman life, the spolia opima, by killing an enemy chieftain in single combat during the wars in northern Italy. Where Fabius counseled patience, Marcellus believed Rome needed to demonstrate that its soldiers could face Hannibal without breaking. At the town of Nola, a loyalist city in Campania, Marcellus engaged Hannibal in a series of limited skirmishes across 216 and 215 BC. Rome did not win these exchanges decisively, but that was almost beside the point. The engagements demonstrated something psychologically vital: that Roman soldiers could fight Hannibal's veterans, suffer losses, and remain in the field. Marcellus was not trying to destroy Hannibal. He was trying to prove that Hannibal was not invincible. The punishment of defectors proceeded with systematic brutality. Cities that had opened their gates to Hannibal found, as Roman power slowly reasserted itself across the region, that loyalty had a very long memory in Rome. The reconquest was not merely military. It was designed to make an example. No example was more deliberate or more consequential than the fate of Capua. The great southern city, Rome's second largest, had welcomed Hannibal after Cannae with celebration. By 211 BC, Rome had encircled it with 2 siege lines and held them even when Hannibal himself marched north to relieve the city. His gamble, a bold strike toward Rome, caused momentary panic in the capital. Citizens ran through the streets, and Roman commanders received frantic dispatches. But the Senate held its nerve. The besieging armies received orders to stay in place around Capua, regardless of what was happening behind them. It was a remarkable act of strategic discipline. Hannibal reached the walls of Rome, rode along them on horseback, and accomplished nothing. The city was defended. The siege lines around Capua did not move. He had no siege equipment capable of threatening Rome's walls, and his bluff, brilliant as theater, changed nothing on the ground. Capua fell. The Senate's revenge was deliberate and public. The city's aristocracy was executed or driven into exile. Capua's status as a self-governing city was stripped away entirely. It would be administered directly by a Roman prefect, a settlement that would stand for generations. Every wavering Italian community watched and understood the message clearly. And yet Hannibal remained undefeated in the field. He continued winning skirmishes, continued demonstrating tactical brilliance in engagements across the south. The grinding paradox of his Italian campaign had become impossible to escape. He could not be beaten in battle, and battle had become irrelevant. Rome had found the answer to genius, and that answer was patience, numbers, and a willingness to make the entire peninsula into a slow, suffocating trap. The war's center of gravity was shifting, and it was shifting somewhere Hannibal had never wanted to look, across the water, toward his home. The Italian stalemate was only one theater of a war being fought across an entire sea. While Hannibal burned farms in Campania and Rome shadowed him with patient legions, 2 Roman commanders were cutting at something far more vital: the supply lines and reinforcements that might actually have allowed Hannibal to finish what he started. Gnaeus and Publius Scipio, 2 brothers fighting in the Iberian Peninsula, understood what many in Rome were only beginning to grasp. Hannibal's army in Italy was magnificent but finite. Every soldier lost to disease, skirmish, or desertion could not easily be replaced. Spain was where replacements came from. Spain was where the money came from. Sever that connection, and Hannibal's undefeated army would slowly bleed itself dry. Beginning in 218 BC, the Scipio brothers waged a relentless campaign across the peninsula, winning allies among the Iberian tribes, threatening Carthaginian supply bases, and preventing army after army from making the brutal Alpine crossing that Hannibal had managed. Their success was extraordinary. For years, Carthage poured resources into Spain rather than Italy. Hasdrubal, Hannibal's own brother, was held in place when he should have been marching north. But Spain's geography was vast and unforgiving, and Carthage eventually responded with overwhelming force. In 211 BC, the same year Capua fell in Italy, both Scipio brothers were killed in separate engagements within weeks of each other. The Spanish front, so carefully constructed over 7 years, came within a breath of total collapse. Roman survivors retreated north of the Ebro River, clinging to what little territory remained. The crisis in Spain was real. What Rome needed was someone extraordinary. While Spain teetered, another drama was unfolding in Sicily. Syracuse, the great Greek city on the island's eastern coast, had abandoned its alliance with Rome following Cannae, calculating, as so many did, that Hannibal had effectively ended Roman power. Marcellus, the aggressive commander who had sparred with Hannibal at Nola, was sent to bring it back into line. What followed was one of the most remarkable sieges in ancient history, made remarkable largely by one elderly man. Archimedes, the greatest mathematician and engineer of his age, had designed the city's defenses personally. His cranes lifted Roman ships from the water and dashed them against the rocks. His artillery found ranges and angles that seemed impossible. For 2 years, the city held. Syracuse finally fell in 212 BC, taken not by direct assault, but through a breach discovered during a festival when the defenders' attention wandered. Marcellus sacked it. Archimedes, absorbed in a geometric problem as the city fell around him, was killed by a Roman soldier who did not know, or perhaps did not care, who he was. Across 3 theaters simultaneously, Rome had demonstrated something Carthage could never match: the capacity to absorb catastrophe and keep fighting everywhere at once. The question was whether anyone in Rome was bold enough to turn that capacity into a killing blow. Rome found its answer in a man who had no business holding the command they gave him. Publius Cornelius Scipio was 25 years old when the Roman assembly voted to send him to Spain. He had never commanded an army. He held no official magistracy that would have traditionally qualified him for such a role. He was, by every conventional measure, too young, too inexperienced, and too untested. The senators who voted for him likely knew all of this. They voted for him anyway, because no one else was willing to go, and because something in the young man's bearing suggested he understood things that older, more cautious men did not. He had been at Cannae. He had watched the legions dissolve around him. Whatever fear that day had planted in other survivors, it seemed to have burned something different into Scipio, a determination to understand exactly how it had happened and to use that understanding as a weapon. His first move announced what kind of commander he would be. In 209 BC, Scipio learned that the 3 Carthaginian armies in Spain were operating separately, each several days' march from the others. Their supply base and administrative capital, Carthago Nova, sat on the coast, brilliant with accumulated treasure and war material, defended by a garrison of barely 1,000 men. The city's commanders considered it safe precisely because every general assumed no one would be reckless enough to strike so deep so fast. Scipio struck in 5 days. He moved his entire force to the walls before Carthage could respond, combined a land assault with a naval attack from the harbor, and waded his men through a lagoon that local fishermen told him dropped to knee-height on certain tides. By nightfall, Rome held the most important city in Carthaginian Spain. The treasure, the hostages, the supplies, and the political prestige all changed hands in a single afternoon. Where most commanders would have stopped to consolidate, Scipio studied. He reviewed how Hannibal had broken Roman armies, how the encirclements worked, how the oblique advance and the bending center had turned numerical disadvantage into annihilation. He did not copy these methods blindly. He absorbed them and made them his own. The culmination came at Ilipa in 206 BC. Facing a Carthaginian force larger than his own, Scipio reversed everything the enemy expected. He placed his Spanish allied troops, his weakest soldiers, at the center and massed his best Roman legions on the flanks. When the Carthaginians arranged their own strongest troops opposite what they assumed would be the main Roman effort, Scipio attacked before they had finished eating breakfast, before they had completed their formations, before their commanders had fully grasped what was happening. His flanks drove inward. His center held back. The Carthaginians, strong in the middle and collapsing on both sides, were destroyed. It was Cannae reversed, and it was deliberate. By the end of 206 BC, Carthage was finished in Spain. The peninsula that had launched Hannibal, funded his wars, and sheltered his brothers was gone. What Rome had nearly lost after 211 BC was now irrevocably in Roman hands. But Scipio was not thinking about Spain anymore. He had a larger idea, one that terrified the cautious men in the Senate and electrified everyone else. Italy could wait. Sicily could wait. The legions should sail directly for Africa, strike at Carthage itself, and force Hannibal to abandon Italy or watch his home city burn. The question was whether Rome would let him try. While Scipio was dismantling Carthaginian power in Spain, Hannibal waited. He had been waiting for years, holding his position in the Italian south, watching his army age and shrink, trusting that reinforcements would eventually come. In 207 BC, they finally did. Or very nearly did. Hasdrubal Barca, the younger brother who had defended Spain while Hannibal marched on Rome, now retraced that legendary journey himself. He crossed the Pyrenees, moved through Gaul, and brought his army over the Alps in a passage remarkably swifter than his brother's original crossing. He had learned from Hannibal's example. The route was known now, the logistics understood, the mountain tribes somewhat more accommodating. Hasdrubal descended into northern Italy with a force that, combined with Hannibal's veterans in the south, might finally give Carthage the decisive numerical advantage it had always needed. The Romans understood exactly what was at stake. Two Carthaginian armies uniting on Italian soil was the nightmare scenario that Roman strategists had feared since Trebia and Trasimene. Everything depended on preventing that junction. Then fate handed Rome an extraordinary gift. Hasdrubal's dispatch riders, carrying messages that detailed the planned rendezvous point with Hannibal, were captured by Roman patrols. The letters were rushed to the consul Gaius Claudius Nero, operating in the south to keep Hannibal pinned. Nero read the dispatches and made a decision that history would remember as one of the boldest of the entire war. He would leave a covering force to watch Hannibal and march north in secret. Not with his entire army. With 7,000 of his best soldiers, moving fast, moving at night where possible, covering roughly 250 miles in less than 7 days to link up with his fellow consul Marcus Livius Salinator near the Metaurus River. Hannibal, in the south, would not know he was gone until it was too late. The combined Roman force met Hasdrubal's army in June of 207 BC beside the Metaurus River in Umbria. Hasdrubal recognized immediately that he was outnumbered and that something had gone wrong. He attempted to withdraw during the night, but his guides either deserted him or lost their way in the darkness, and dawn found his army still dangerously close to the Roman position. The battle that followed was brutal and, for a time, balanced. Hasdrubal anchored his right flank on a steep riverbank that made direct assault nearly impossible. Nero, watching his colleagues struggle, made another improvising decision. He pulled his troops from the unengaged sector, marched them around the rear of his own lines, and crashed into Hasdrubal's exposed flank. The Carthaginian formation buckled and then shattered. Hasdrubal himself rode into the Roman lines rather than surrender, dying as he had fought. The message Rome sent south was grotesque in its deliberateness. Hasdrubal's severed head was carried down the length of Italy and thrown into Hannibal's camp. When Hannibal looked at what the Romans had delivered to him, he reportedly said words that have echoed across 2,000 years. "I see," he told those around him, "the fate of Carthage." He was still dangerous. His army was still intact. He would remain in Italy for 4 more years, undefeated in the field, a lion that Rome dared not corner directly. But he would never again threaten Rome itself. The reinforcements he had waited for were gone. The strategy that had brought him within reach of victory was now irrevocably dead. The war's center of gravity was shifting, just as a young general in Rome was preparing to argue that the only way to end this was to carry the fight to Africa itself. The question hanging over Rome in the years after the Metaurus was not whether the war could be won, but how and where and by whom. The answer increasingly came in the form of one name: Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young general who had rebuilt Roman power in Spain from nothing, who had taken Cartagena in a single audacious morning, who seemed to possess some instinct for warfare that his contemporaries could not quite explain. He had a plan. Carry the war to Africa. Threaten Carthage itself. Force Hannibal home. The Roman Senate was not convinced. Fabius Maximus, the old architect of the strategy of delay, rose to oppose him. Fabius had been right once, when Rome was bleeding and desperate. He argued that opening a new front was reckless, that Hannibal still prowled southern Italy unbeaten, that glory-hunting ambition should not determine Roman strategy. His objections were not foolish. They were simply, in the end, outvoted. Scipio received permission to cross to Africa, though the Senate, hedging its approval, gave him a relatively modest force and left much of the expedition's financing to his own arrangements. If he wanted this war, he would have to build it himself. He landed in North Africa in 204 BC, near the shores of what is today Tunisia. And almost immediately, he found an ally whose contribution to the campaign would prove essential. Massinissa, a Numidian prince whose cavalry had once fought for Carthage, now brought his horsemen to Scipio's cause. The Numidians were the finest light cavalry in the ancient world, fast and lethal and knowledgeable about the terrain. They were also exactly what Roman armies had consistently lacked against Carthaginian forces. With Massinissa beside him, Scipio had finally closed that gap. What followed demonstrated that Scipio had not simply learned from Hannibal. He had internalized something deeper, a willingness to use deception as a primary weapon rather than a supplement to force. Hasdrubal Gisco, commanding the Carthaginian forces in Africa, and Syphax, the Numidian king who had allied with Carthage, had established fortified camps near the city of Utica. Scipio entered negotiations with them, sending envoys to discuss terms, allowing those envoys time to observe the layout of both camps, their construction, their routines. He had no intention of making peace. He was gathering intelligence. Then, on a single night in 203 BC, his forces struck both camps simultaneously in darkness. Syphax's camp, built largely of reeds and timber, was set ablaze. Hasdrubal's men, rushing to help their allies, ran directly into waiting Roman formations. The slaughter was catastrophic. Ancient sources speak of tens of thousands killed in a single night, though the precise numbers are difficult to verify. What is beyond doubt is that two armies ceased to exist before dawn. Hasdrubal and Syphax assembled a new force. Scipio destroyed it too in the open fields along the Bagridas River at what history remembers as the Battle of the Great Plains in the spring of 203 BC. It was not close. The walls of Carthage were now visible on the horizon. In the city itself, the council that had once sent Hannibal out to conquer the world now faced an unthinkable decision. 15 years after he had crossed the Alps, 15 years of victories and sieges and winters in the Italian south, they sent word recalling him home. The general who had never been defeated in Italy was now being summoned to defend the city he had set out to destroy Rome for. The final confrontation, the one that would settle everything, was coming. He had asked for the meeting himself. In the days before the battle, Hannibal sent a messenger to Scipio requesting a conference between the two commanders. It was an unusual gesture, perhaps unprecedented at this scale, and its meaning was debated then as it is now. Was he seeking genuinely favorable terms? Was he hoping to read the younger man, to find some weakness in his character that could be exploited on the field? Or did Hannibal, the greatest general of his age, simply want to look into the eyes of the one opponent who had matched him? They met somewhere on the plain near Zama in October of 202 BC, each accompanied by interpreters and a small escort. Two men who had shaped the entire Mediterranean world stood face to face. Hannibal spoke first, according to the historian Polybius. He spoke of the dangers of fortune, of how quickly it reversed, of how Carthage would accept terms that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. He suggested peace. Scipio refused. The terms Carthage had already agreed to and then violated during the armistice were the floor, not the ceiling. There was nothing left to negotiate. Both men returned to their armies. What Hannibal brought to Zama was formidable on paper. 80 war elephants lined his front. Behind them, 3 lines of infantry, the last composed of his veterans from Italy, the men who had walked across the Alps, who had stood at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae. They were still individually among the finest soldiers alive. Hannibal had won with this before. He expected to win with it again. He had not accounted for what Scipio had spent the previous weeks preparing. The Roman legions at Zama were not arranged in their traditional checkerboard formation. Scipio had ordered his maniples aligned in direct columns, creating clear lanes running through the entire Roman line from front to back. When the elephants charged, the Romans did not break and scatter. The animals ran forward into empty corridors, trumpeting and confused, many turning sideways and trampling Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings. Those that ran straight through were funneled harmlessly to the rear. In a single decision, Scipio had neutralized 80 animals that had terrorized armies across a generation of warfare. Then the cavalry struck. Maecenas' Numidians, the horsemen whose ancestors had ridden for Carthage, pursued the Carthaginian and allied cavalry off the field entirely. The Roman allied cavalry did the same on the opposite flank. The infantry battle in the center was fierce, grinding down through Hannibal's first 2 lines with heavy losses on both sides. But Hannibal's veterans, his final line, held. For a moment, the battle hung suspended. Then the cavalry returned. Having run the Carthaginian horse from the field, Maecenas and the Roman riders wheeled and crashed into Hannibal's rear. Encircled, with no escape and no relief coming, the army of Carthage was destroyed. Ancient sources place Carthaginian dead at around 20,000, with a similar number captured. Among those who escaped was Hannibal himself. Riding hard into the desert with a handful of survivors, a general without an army for the first time in his life. The peace terms Scipio imposed were devastating. Carthage surrendered its entire war fleet, all but 10 ships. It abandoned every territory outside North Africa. It agreed to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents across 50 years. Most significantly, it could not wage war on any nation without Rome's explicit permission. Carthage was not destroyed in 202 BC, but it ceased, from that moment forward, to be a power capable of determining its own fate. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had survived Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. It had outlasted one of the greatest military minds in history. And Scipio, the general who had carried the war to Africa when no one else would, returned home to a city that called him, simply, Africanus. But survival and settlement are 2 different things. The question of what to do with Carthage would not stay answered for long. He had saved Carthage from destruction. Now Carthage would destroy him. In the years following Zama, Hannibal did something unexpected for a defeated general. He entered politics, elected Safite, the highest civic office in Carthage, around 196 BC. He threw himself into reforming a system that had, in his judgment, lost the war just as surely as any Roman sword had. The Carthaginian oligarchy was riddled with corruption. Judges enriched themselves through permanent tenure. Public funds disappeared into private estates. Hannibal moved against all of it with the same ruthless efficiency he had once applied to Roman supply lines. He was, by most accounts, effective. And effectiveness made him enemies. The oligarchs he threatened knew exactly what weapon to reach for. They sent word to Rome, suggesting that Hannibal was secretly planning a new war, conspiring with the Seleucid king Antiochus III in the east. Whether they genuinely believed this hardly mattered. Rome sent commissioners to investigate, and that was enough. Facing arrest and certain death, Hannibal fled Carthage in 195 BC, never to return. What followed was a long, diminishing exile. He found refuge at the court of Antiochus III, offering his services to the one monarch powerful enough to challenge Rome. But the relationship was uneasy. Antiochus was proud, surrounded by his own advisors, and reluctant to listen to a foreign fugitive, however celebrated. Hannibal counseled bold action, a direct invasion of Italy. Antiochus preferred caution. When Rome defeated Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, the king signed a peace treaty that included, among its terms, the surrender of Hannibal. He escaped again, always escaping. He moved from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean, a legend growing older and more isolated, advising kings who feared Rome too much to truly use him. He spent time in Crete, in Armenia, and finally in Bithynia, a small kingdom in northwestern Anatolia, helping its king wage a modest naval campaign against a neighboring state. Rome eventually pressured Bithynia to hand him over as well. This time there was nowhere left to run. In 183 BC, with Roman soldiers surrounding his villa, Hannibal reached for a ring he had long carried. Hidden inside it was poison. His reported last words, preserved by the historian Livy, were characteristically defiant. "Let us free Rome," he is said to have declared, "from her long anxiety." By one of history's quieter ironies, Scipio Africanus died the same year, also in exile, also estranged from a Roman political class that had grown suspicious of his fame and independence. The two men who had defined an era, who had circled each other across decades and continents, left the world within months of each other. Carthage itself survived them both, but in Rome, certain voices were already asking whether that should be allowed to continue. Carthage was not supposed to recover. The treaty that ended the Second Punic War had been designed to ensure exactly that, an indemnity of 10,000 talents to be paid over 50 years. Its warships reduced to 10. Its territory stripped back. Its very right to wage war made conditional on Roman approval. Rome had built a cage around its greatest enemy, and the expectation, spoken or not, was that the animal inside would slowly wither. Instead, Carthage went to work. Stripped of military ambition, the city redirected every ounce of its extraordinary commercial genius back into trade. Its merchant fleets fanned out across the Mediterranean. Its agricultural estates in North Africa, managed with sophisticated techniques that Roman farmers would later copy almost verbatim, produced grain and olive oil in staggering quantities. Within a generation, Carthage was paying down its war debt ahead of schedule. Within 2, it had rebuilt itself into one of the wealthiest cities in the known world. This was, to certain Romans, utterly intolerable. In 153 BC, a Roman delegation traveled to Carthage to arbitrate yet another border dispute with the neighboring Numidian king Massinissa, Rome's loyal ally and increasingly aggressive neighbor. Among the delegates was Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder, a man of ferocious moral conservatism and a talent for channeling genuine belief into political weapon. What he saw in Carthage shook him. Packed markets, crowded harbors, a city not just surviving but flourishing, its streets humming with the confidence of renewed prosperity. Cato returned to Rome and never forgot what he had seen. From that point forward, he ended every speech in the Senate with the same 6 words, regardless of the topic under discussion: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. Tax policy, land reform, military appointments. It did not matter. Every speech concluded with the same ritual demand, the same reminder, the same obsession made into incantation. He was not alone in his fears. Rome had suffered too much at Carthaginian hands to view its recovery with anything like equanimity. But Cato gave those fears a voice, relentless and impossible to ignore. Rome's instrument of pressure was Massinissa. For years, the Numidian king had been nibbling at Carthaginian territory, provoking conflicts and then appealing to Rome as arbiter, knowing whose side Rome would take. Carthage endured it, complained, received nothing. Finally, in 150 BC, pushed beyond its limits, Carthage raised an army and fought back without seeking Roman permission. This was the pretext Rome had been waiting for. Under the terms of the peace treaty, Carthage had committed an act of war. Cato's ritual words were about to become policy. The old man, already near the end of his long life, would finally get what he had demanded from every rostrum in Rome. Carthage would be destroyed. The only question now was how. Rome's answer came in the form of an ultimatum, delivered with the cold precision of a city that had already made up its mind. First, the weapons. Carthage was ordered to surrender all arms, all military equipment, all instruments of war. The Carthaginians complied, sending 300 hostages to Rome and delivering cartloads of swords, spears, and catapults to the Roman fleet anchored offshore. It was a humiliation swallowed in the hope of peace. Then came the second demand. The Carthaginians were to abandon their city entirely. They could settle elsewhere in North Africa, but no closer than 15 miles from the sea. For a merchant civilization whose entire identity, whose centuries of history and commerce and culture was bound to the harbor, this was not a relocation. It was an annihilation in everything but name. The Carthaginian envoys wept openly in the Roman Senate. It made no difference. What happened next surprised Rome. Stripped of hope, Carthage chose fury. The city erupted. Citizens who had accepted disarmament now understood they had been deceived, and they turned every resource at hand toward defense. Temple ornaments were melted down and recast as swords. Women cut their hair to braid into bowstrings. Streets were converted into workshops running day and night, forging weapons from whatever metal could be found. The city that Rome expected to walk quietly into oblivion decided instead to fight. The siege that followed lasted 3 years, from 149 to 146 BC. For much of that time, Rome's forces accomplished little. 2 successive Roman commanders failed to breach the city's formidable walls, frustrated by Carthaginian defenders who had transformed desperation into terrifying ingenuity. Rome, the city that had stumbled through the Punic Wars on the strength of stubbornness and numbers, was stumbling again. Then came Scipio Aemilianus. The grandson by adoption of the great Scipio Africanus, he was elected consul in 147 BC and given command of the Carthaginian operation. He was 37 years old. What he found was a besieging army that had grown slack and disorganized, its discipline eroded by years of inconclusive fighting. Scipio rebuilt it from the ground up, restoring order through relentless drilling and personal authority. He was his grandfather's heir in more than name. He tightened the siege methodically, cutting off the harbor, blocking supply lines, starving the city into weakness. When his forces finally broke through the outer walls in the spring of 146 BC, what waited inside was not surrender but 6 days of the most brutal urban combat the ancient world had witnessed. Street by street, building by building, the Romans fought their way through Carthage. Soldiers cleared each floor of every structure, throwing the defenders down from upper stories and pressing forward over the rubble. Fire spread continuously, and still the fighting continued through the smoke and ash and ruin. The Carthaginian commander Hasdrubal eventually surrendered, though thousands of his soldiers and citizens retreated to the Temple of Eshmun and burned with it rather than yield. When it was over, the survivors, perhaps 50,000 people from a city that had once held hundreds of thousands, were sold into slavery. The buildings were demolished systematically over the days that followed. What fire had not consumed, Roman engineering removed stone by stone. Standing at the edge of what had been the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean, Scipio Aemilianus watched it burn. His companion Polybius, the historian who recorded the moment, noted that Scipio wept. Asked why, the general quoted Homer's words on the fall of Troy. "A day will come," he said, "when sacred Troy will perish, and Priam, and the people of Priam." He was weeping. Polybius understood, not for Carthage alone, but for every great city, every empire, Rome itself perhaps, that must one day meet the same fate. The man who destroyed Carthage mourned what destruction meant. Whether Rome understood his tears is another question entirely. The legend says Rome salted the earth of Carthage after its destruction, cursing the ground so nothing would ever grow there again. It is almost certainly not true. Modern historians find no credible ancient source for it, and the Romans had every intention of using that fertile North African soil for themselves. But the legend persists, because it captures something emotionally accurate even if it is factually wrong. The destruction of Carthage felt so total, so deliberate, so final, that only a curse seemed adequate to describe it. Within a century of the city's fall, Rome had organized the surrounding territory into the province of Africa, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the entire empire. What had been Carthaginian fields now fed Roman mouths. What had been a rival civilization became a Roman breadbasket. The erasure was not just military. It was administrative, agricultural, and cultural. Carthage did not simply lose. It was absorbed, overwritten, and forgotten. This is the deeper lesson the Punic Wars leave behind. Carthage produced one of the most gifted military commanders in the history of human conflict. Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps, shattered Roman armies at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae, and spent 15 years marching through Italy essentially undefeated in the field. Military academies have studied him ever since. Napoleon studied his encirclement tactics. Norman Schwarzkopf cited Cannae as an influence on the ground strategy of the Gulf War in 1991. No Roman general of the era came close to matching Hannibal's tactical imagination. And yet, Carthage lost. Rome won. Why? Because Rome was not a single brilliant general. Rome was a system. It was a republic that could absorb catastrophic losses at Cannae, bury its dead, and immediately begin raising new legions. It was a network of allied Italian cities that, with a handful of exceptions, held firm even when Hannibal stood at the gates of Rome itself. It was a political culture that granted emergency powers to a dictator when necessary and then expected him to surrender them when the crisis passed. Carthage had Hannibal. Rome had institutions. The haunting question that lingers over this entire history is what was lost when Carthage was erased. The Carthaginians left few written records that survived. Their language, their literature, their religious texts, their understanding of the world, nearly all of it gone. We know Carthage primarily through Roman and Greek sources, written by people who had every reason to describe them as cruel, barbaric, and deserving of their fate. Who the Carthaginians truly were, what they believed, what stories they told their children at night, remains largely beyond recovery. Rome's greatest victory may have also been history's most expensive act of forgetting. The city that wept for itself in Scipio's imagination never had the chance to weep for Carthage at all. Rome's enduring lesson is not that genius loses, but that while stubbornly refusing to break, outlasts even the greatest brilliance. Subscribe for more stories history almost forgot.